members of regional economic bodies, the leadership of the Alliance of Indigenous Peoples, Local Communities for Conservation in Africa, Indigenous and community leaders and members, RRI coalition members, distinguished participants and colleagues. On behalf of my colleague, Mr. Patrick Kipalu, who could not be here with us today, it is an honor and privilege for me to be with you at this first ever Community Conservation Congress of the African continent. My name is Alain Tachet, and I'm Director of Rights, Climate and Conservation of the Rights and Resources Initiative. On behalf of RRI's coalition, I offer our sincere gratitude to the government of Namibia, particularly the Ministers of Gender, Equality and Social Welfare, the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Tourism, and the Ministry of Home Affairs, Immigration and Safety and Security, who spared no effort to hold the Strategic Congress at this period of great climate and biodiversity crisis. Our thanks also go to the Community Leaders Network of Southern Africa and the IPLC Alliance for their invaluable leadership and contribution in organizing this event. The Rights and Resources Initiative, or RRI as more widely known, is a global coalition of over 150 organizations dedicated to advancing the land, forest, and resource rights of Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendant peoples, and local communities, and especially women and youth within these groups. We are gathered here today at this historic Congress to discuss the future of rights-based community conservation in Africa. The main objective of this meeting is to explore ways to strengthen the protection of community land and recognize the essential role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in preserving nature. This initiative is of fundamental importance to Africa as we seek to preserve our biodiversity while respecting the rights and traditional communities. Indigenous peoples and local communities represent over 2 billion people. Together, they hold customary rights to over 50% of the world's land area, yet they only have legal rights to 11% of this land. Yet, as I stand before you today, we are witnessing significant and welcome transformation in Africa's land sector. African governments and regional institutions are increasingly recognizing the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities as the key drivers of social peace, conservation, and sustainable development. This is especially critical in this time of global climate and biodiversity crisis, where Africa, given its vast natural ecosystems and resources, has such a crucial role to play. Between 2015 and 2020, Africa witnessed a 12% increase in the total area owned or designated for communities, surpassing all other regions, with many countries taking first steps towards the implementation of dedicated reforms. The progressive legislation that is now emerging across the continent is eloquent proof of this transformation, providing unprecedented opportunities for governments to change the reality of land governance in Africa by upholding the long-neglected rights of rural and forest communities. With the adoption of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, the world committed itself to bringing at least 30% of the planet's terrestrial and marine areas under formal conservation management by 2030. Though the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities are to be recognized and respected in the realization of this goal, the history of conservation, especially in Africa, is replete with forced evictions, sometimes violent, of Indigenous peoples and local communities, criminalization of locally adapted livelihoods, and the establishment of fortress conservation measures that have deprived landscapes of the very people who for generations have stewarded and maintained the biodiversity that underpins our collective well-being. The mere fact that the vast majority of the planet's biodiversity lies in the lands and territories of Indigenous peoples and local communities is no mere coincidence. It is the affirmation of the unparalleled effectiveness of community-led conservation. Today, 56% of the people living in important biodiversity conservation areas in low and middle income countries, compared to only 9% in developed countries. This both affirms the stewardship of Indigenous peoples and local communities and reminds us that the burden of conservation disproportionately falls on the global south. But the future of conservation need not be a threat to communities. Research shows that rights-based conservation offers the oldest and most effective, efficient, and equitable means of protecting the world's biodiversity. Today, however, biodiversity conservation has been grounded in the convention that governments are the best custodians of the commons. Yet despite the exponential growth in the number of protected areas, 2/3 of which occurred in developing countries, none of the biodiversity targets that have so far been established, whether through the World Parks Congress or the Convention on Global Biodiversity, have so far been achieved. Over the past 5 decades, research shows that legally recognized community lands store more carbon, hold more biodiversity, exhibit lower rates of deforestation and land degradation, and support the well-being of more people than lands administered by governments or private entities. Now is the time for African policymakers, Western governments, and the global conservation movement to come together and recognize that the answer to the global biodiversity crisis lies in recognizing the rights of the traditional conservation guardians by upholding their leadership and investing in their conservation efforts. It is the time to underscore the importance of the legal recognition and protection of the land and territorial rights of communities, including the rights to self-determination, by advancing the traditional knowledge and governance systems as the basis for achieving the targets and priorities of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Now is the time to leverage the emerging suite of rights-based approaches, such as co-management, Indigenous managed protected areas, Indigenous territorial governance, community-led conservation initiatives, to channel the resources and support that traditional guardians need to achieve the ambition of the Global Biodiversity Framework. Let us use this Congress to challenge ourselves, overcome barriers, and articulate new models of conservation that build on the knowledge systems, ways of life, and land use practices of African peoples. Again, I offer my sincere thanks to the Namibian government, as well as our partners, the Community Leaders Network and AICA, for making this event possible. I also wish to thank my colleagues, Mr. Patrick Kipalu, Dr. Kendi Barona, Michel Sonku, Jean-Ousmane Camera, and Alexandra Romero, as well as Marco Mau, for their strategic support in contributing to the organization of this historic event. Excellencies and participants, I truly hope that this conference will be a moment of candid exchange and thoughtful sharing of experiences from countries with regards to rights-oriented community conservation on the continent. We look forward to the robust discussion ahead. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much for that statement. I'm sure we can still thank him for those kind words. We are continuing with our program, and I'm sure you are realizing that although it is taking time, this is the conversation around the fire. And that is the seating arrangement that my colleague helped to explain. And it is around this conversation that it's important to acknowledge who is present. Because that helps us to ask the question, who is still not here? It is also to acknowledge that we have reached a time in our journey of development that we cannot just talk to each other as the same group. Communities need government, government needs communities, officials need communities, ministers need communities, civil society needs government, and it cannot only just be the elders that needs to have the conversation. The youth needs to be part of that conversation. And that is, I think, what we are trying to demonstrate, and we shall continue with our program. And I think now is the time that we, whilst thanking and appreciating the patience of our senior leaders that are present here, it's time to open now the floor for them to be able to make their statements, to greet us. And we shall now call upon the State Minister from Ethiopia, State Minister for Irrigation and Lowlands, Honorable Andreas Gera. Please help me to